Sandy Monroe has talked about it, and I've talked about it on a number of occasions, but it's even worse than you think. The Chinese tsunami is going to be a double tsunami. Better watch out. For those of you interested in investing, check out WeBull, an amazing platform for buying and selling stocks, and now cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and others. Open an account and get a free stock valued at up to $200, and fund your account and get another free stock valued at up to $1,600. Check out the link in the description and help the channel at the same time. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. So today I want to talk a little bit, again, this is a more speculative episode. I should be wearing my It's Speculation t-shirt, but I'll put a card for it up in the corner so you can go shopping. It's down in the description. Anyway, I want to talk about a couple of historical antecedents that can help give us some perspective on what's going to happen with Chinese automobiles and the rest of the globe in the next 10 years or so. But it's actually worse than that. But first, let's take a look at a couple of historical antecedents. So the first antecedent I want to talk about is the quartz crisis. I happen to be a huge, horological aficionado, so I love watches. I love mechanical watches. I happen to be wearing my Apple Watch right now, but anyway, I have an Omega Seamaster Pro 300, and actually I did a review of that up there if you're interested in watching that. But anyway, so I do have some knowledge about this historical trend, and actually I was alive when it happened. So what happened was in the 1950s and 60s, mechanical watches were at their sort of zenith, right? They were all the thing. It was really the only choice people had. You had to wear a watch, and it was mechanical. There were no such thing as electronic watches at the time. But on the horizon, companies like Omega, which actually invented the very first quartz watch, and it was in competition with the Japanese, interestingly enough. It's a very, very interesting history. Essentially what happened was Seiko in Japan started trying to get into the competitions in Switzerland and prove that their watches were as good as or better than Swiss watches. And as a way of competing with that, Omega and other companies banded together to try to create a even more precise watch. So they came up with the quartz watch. The problem was, what they didn't realize was going to happen was Japan was going to take that idea and take it from being a very, very high-end luxury, bespoke type of watch where it's like hand-built per one, to mass marketing this thing. And so this was like 1968, and by the mid-1970s, the entire mechanical watch industry pretty much had collapsed, and Switzerland was in turmoil because a lot of their economy was based on building high-end watches, and a lot of companies went out of business, and a lot of companies almost went out of business. And you can make an argument that Audemars Piguet and their Royal Oak, their crazy expensive stainless steel sports watch, was the kind of saving grace of the Swiss watch industry, plus the fact this watch group got into it in the 1980s and kind of recovered. So now there's a rebalancing of things. But anyway, what happened was the Japanese ability to manufacture at a very, very inexpensive price watches that were actually more accurate than the mechanical watches the Swiss were building, or at least as accurate, but for a fraction of the price, meant that the old industry was completely disrupted. There was a Japanese, tsunami, you could say, around the globe of much less expensive watches that were quartz-based. And then, of course, that led to digital type watches, and that eventually led to actually something like this. So, that sort of trend started in the early 1970s for those of you who are not as ancient as I am. So that was one of these historical antecedents that sort of shows how incredibly quickly an entire industry can be upended, and how a country like Japan can completely take over. The other historical antecedent also has to do with Japan, and that is the Japanese car invasion in the late 1970s into the early 1980s. And this was a little bit different because the automobile sector was really, at least in the United States, was dominated by the United States. I think GM had a 55% market share at one point in the 1970s, which is just mind-blowing for anybody to have that kind of market share. And then, of course, you had VW and other companies, and BMW and Mercedes, et cetera, that were coming out of Europe, but they tended to be either like super, super cheap cars like VW Beetles at that time, or very expensive cars like Mercedes or BMW. So they were kind of filling these two ends of the spectrum. But what happened was Japan said, hey, we can build good enough cars that are not, super sexy or anything like that, but they function perfectly fine, and they're way cheaper than the cars that are being manufactured in the United States, and they're more reliable. That was a huge part of the factor, and one of the reasons why I pretty much, until I bought a Tesla, only ever bought Japanese-made cars. And I literally would go and make sure that they were manufactured in Japan. They had the J or the 5 as the first digit of their VIN, because I trusted Japanese manufacturing, because I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I saw just how crappy US auto manufacturing was and how good Japanese auto manufacturing was. So I've stuck with that, and actually the Tesla is one of the very first cars that I have bought that was not manufactured in Japan. So go Tesla, I'm buying American again. So hey, there you go. But anyway, so what happened was you had an industry that again was ripe for disruption. It had only adequate products. They were charging too much money. They were making a lot of profit. They were essentially fat middle-aged men, like, getting those bellies like I am. And they're just comfortable. They're like, everything's good, everything's fine. And when Japan started making waves about this, right? So the first thing that happens with a tsunami is not the tsunami itself. It's like the water kind of goes back out and you realize something is about to happen. And you're like, uh-oh, what's about to happen? So the waves are going out, right? And what happened was the American car manufacturers just ignored it. They said, this is all fine, no big deal. Everything is cool. And then when people said, yeah, but Japanese auto manufacturers are going to come in and like take the low end of the market, they said, who cares? That's not a profitable market segment. We like our trucks. We like our big cars. We like our profitable cars. Who cares about the low end of the market? Well, history is a pretty good judge of what exactly happened after that. And obviously what happened was Japan started at the low end of the market, but now they've taken over the high end of the market. They're all over the place with brands that fill every single niche from the very, very low end of the market all the way up to the very, very highest end of the market. So what does this tell us about what's going to happen with Chinese automobiles? Well, number one, the Chinese market is the largest auto market in the world, and I think a lot of people who don't live in China or don't have a good understanding of that don't realize that. It is a cutthroat industry. It's been in existence for quite a while, and they manufacture a ton of cars because they have a huge market. Now, it's been very insular so far. They've mostly only sold within China, but when you have 1 billion people in the country, that's a pretty decent sized market already, right? It's a lot bigger than the United States and Europe. And of course, you've got the Chinese manufacturing business, and the workers are extremely motivated. Sandy Munro has talked about this. I would liken them to the Japanese in the 1960s and 1970s, who were very, very motivated as workers, as individuals, to make their country the best possible, to prove that they could manufacture the best equipment, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, what China is doing a little bit differently than the Japanese auto manufacturers is that they are already manufacturing. If you look at Chinese autos, especially their EVs right now, they are pretty sexy looking cars, and they've got really, really good software. So they're not coming in at the low end of the market and just kind of scraping by. And they do have that, of course. They have like $4,000 electric vehicles that look like they would be really dangerous. And they're probably just like large scooters with a roof on them or something, right? They're essentially golf carts. They're souped up golf carts, but they're actually cheaper than golf carts. So anyway, so they've got everything from really, really low end stuff to really, really high end stuff. And that means that when they enter the market, they can actually enter the market at all segments at once. Whatever they want to choose, they can come in the luxury end of things, they can come in at the very, very bottom end, and they can fill in the gaps very, very quickly. So Chinese manufacturing and their gigantic ability to scale and their logistics and their supply chains and everything are one of the disruptive tsunami waves that's coming in. What's the other one? Well, as you might have guessed, since I'm talking about EVs, it's EVs. If you haven't noticed recently, Tesla's orders are extending out 6 months to over a year at this point, depending on what model car you want. The demand for EVs, we've reached the tipping point where people are like, oh crap, this is the car I want. And it's not just Teslas, it's other cars too, although there's a lot of kind of suboptimal EVs that are out there that people aren't super interested in. But if you have a compelling EV, people want that over ICE cars right now. That's becoming very, very obvious. So we're reaching the tipping point. And again, for people who are outside China, and I don't have the most inside view of this myself, but I have read a lot and I've watched a lot of videos about this. The Chinese market is number one, the government is wholly behind moving to the EV cars and the EV, clean energy as fast as possible, because they've had such incredible pollution problems in their large cities before. So they have an extreme motivation, and they happen to be a fascist type of government, so they can do whatever the heck they want. They don't have all this dithering that they have to do. If they make a decision, they go for it. And again, I'm not a big fan of a fascist type of government, but that's what they are. And a huge advantage of that is if the leadership wants to move in a direction, they will move in that direction, and there's no stopping them. So they are heading that way really fast. By the way, a little side note about this, they are also heading into outer space. And the United States is dithering and not giving NASA any money, and pretty much no other country in the world is really providing a great deal of money towards space exploration. So we are right now ceding space to the Chinese. And if that's okay with everybody, that's fine. But I just want people to be aware of that. The Chinese are their space exploration program and their goals are incredibly ambitious, and they're spending a huge amount of money to make this happen. So if people aren't aware of this, China is going to be on the moon. They're going to be putting the next, I guess they would be taikonauts, not astronauts. They'll be putting the next people on the moon before you know it, and then they will be going to Mars, and they will be doing other things. So this is going to happen really, really fast. So if the rest of the world doesn't get up in arms about this and decide to compete, they're going to be outcompeted very quickly. And then what happens with the solar system, I don't know. But that probably means that the first quadrillionaire is going to be a Chinese person, not anybody else. But anyway, back to cars. So what we've got is in China, we've got an incredibly cutthroat auto industry and an incredibly cutthroat EV auto industry in particular. So those two things together mean that there is a kind of Darwinian evolution happening really, really fast there. And they're weeding out all the, they've got hundreds of EV startups. Most of those are going to go out of business, but that doesn't matter. Again, all you need is maybe 3 or 5 or 6, you don't need that many major auto companies. You just need a few of them. And they can fill different niches and they can compete with each other. But if you look at this, they're building cars to the quality of European manufacturing standards right now. So as soon as they release these things, there's a giant pent-up demand for EVs, which is not being met currently right now at all. And there's also a pent-up demand for high-quality cars that are affordable. And these cars are going to cost less than Teslas when they come out, almost definitely. So what that means is that when you get a combination of excellently built EVs for a cheap price, and you've got this giant push from a country that is able to push out these cars all around the world, it is going to be a double tsunami, and it is going to just devastate everything. I mean, seriously. I think Tesla may be able to ride the wave and they may be able to surf it, but everybody else is going to get buried. I think that's what my thumbnail is going to be, is probably Tesla surfing. Like the Tesla logo surfing and all the other logos just getting completely buried by this giant, curling wave that's happening. I'm a surfer, hey, you can actually tell that. But anyway, so I know all about getting steamrolled by a wave and getting tumbled by it. So anyway, I think that that's what's going to happen. And I think a lot of these companies are going to go out of business really fast or they're going to get acquired by these Chinese companies and they're going to become subsidiaries. So something like GM or Ford will be owned by a Chinese company eventually. So anyway, think back to those historical antecedents. The quartz crisis happened in 3 or 4 years. The Japanese auto crisis happened in maybe 4 or 5 years. It does not take a lot of time. The entrenched incumbents think that the world is going to stay the way it was forever. But when disruption happens, it happens fast. And right now we're looking not at a single type of disruption. It's not Chinese auto versus US or European auto. It's Chinese auto versus the rest of the world, and it's EVs versus ICE cars. And I know that companies like VW are talking about still selling ICE cars to places like South America and potentially Africa into the 2030s and into 2040. But something that Claudia, who's one of my Patreon patrons, said in just this morning and made me really go like, was the fact that, hey, guess who builds alternative energy sources? Like, who's the best at that in the world? And that happens to be China. They build solar at amazingly cheap rates. They can do electrical infrastructure. They can do wind. They can do all of this. So they can export all of this stuff to build a new infrastructure out, an electric infrastructure out, and then they can sell cars into that market because they've already sort of predisposed everybody and they can make sure that the plugs are compatible with their cars, whatnot, right? Or at least they have goodwill from these countries because they're building out these gigantic clean energy grids. So it's not going to stop. VW, if you're thinking you're going to be selling ICE cars to these developing countries for another 15 to 20 years, you are dead wrong. It's not. It's going to take a lot less time than that. Maybe by 2030. I think even those countries by 2030 will definitely be shifting heavily towards EV cars. As for the rest of the world, I think by 2026 or 2027, if you're in the United States or Europe, there's a high likelihood that you'll be giving a Chinese car company a good solid look when you purchase your next car. So buyer beware. All right, I hope you found this episode fun and interesting and thought-provoking and maybe a little little bit depressing if you're a fan of American or European or Japanese auto manufacturers, because it's going to be really, really tough in the next 5 or 6 years for all of these companies. Believe me, China is coming for you, and the floodgates are just about to open. There's like little trickles right now. It's kind of like the water's going back out for the tsunami, and everybody's looking around and saying, everything's okay, right? No big deal. Let's just stay on the beach and not worry about it. And the big wave is going to be coming really, really soon. So anyway, I hope that it's not too depressing for people. I think it's good to think about this now, because maybe people can get in front of this wave and they can try to ride it a little bit, but it is coming for sure, without a doubt. Anyway, if you did enjoy this episode, definitely like it so other people can find it, and also consider subscribing for more of this. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon. Thank you all so much. These conversations that I have behind the scenes really help to crystallize these thoughts in my head. So if you're interested in joining the club and having these conversations, taking part in them, definitely check out the link in the description. And if you're interested in some awesome merch, check out the link in the description. We've got the Tesla Bot t-shirt, which is super popular these days. Don't mess with Tesla. Lots of other t-shirts, tumblers, mugs, etc. So check out the link in the description and help the channel out. And for those of you interested in investing, check out WeBull, an amazing platform for buying and selling stocks, and now cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and others. Open an account and get a free stock valued at up to $200, and fund your account and get another free stock valued at up to $1,600. Check out the link in the description and help the channel at the same time. Thank you. And finally, don't forget we are both Tesla and Amazon affiliates. If you look in the description, you can see how clicking on a link and going shopping for a solar roof, a power wall, or anything on Amazon helps out the channel. And as always, feel free to ask me questions in the comments or at my email address, which is drknowitallknows@gmail.com. Till next time, bye-bye.